Night enveloped Charleston, South Carolina, the city's historic charm and deep divides barely visible under the glow of the skyline. The Ravenel Bridge stretched across the dark waters of the Cooper River, a towering structure meant to connect. But on this night, it would serve as a site of separation and betrayal. Darnell Williams, a tall, imposing black man in his early 40s, guided his sleek black Tesla across the bridge, its quiet hum contrasting sharply with the turmoil inside him. His very existence was a paradox, a triumph over adversity in a society that often tried to keep men like him down. Born in Charleston's poverty-stricken East Side, Darnell had risen to become one of the city's most successful real estate developers. He had a net worth that most could only dream of, but his wealth hadn't insulated him from the pervasive racism that shadowed his every move. Darnell's journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. From living in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and broken windows, to owning a portfolio of luxury properties, he had defied every stereotype, but he never forgot his roots. He poured his resources into uplifting the black community, offering scholarships, job opportunities, and building affordable housing in neighborhoods where hope often felt like a distant memory. Yet for all his accomplishments, Darnell knew one truth. In the eyes of men like Special Agent Kyle Rickman, he was still just another black man who didn't belong. Rickman, a 50-year-old FBI veteran, sat in an unmarked car near the bridge, watching Darnell's Tesla glide by. Dressed in a sharp suit with a glinting badge at his hip, Rickman looked every bit the image of authority, but beneath the polished exterior was a festering resentment. He hated how the world was changing, hated seeing men like Darnell rise to levels he believed were reserved for people like him. When Rickman saw the Tesla, his gut tightened with a mix of envy and loathing. To him, a black man in a luxury car meant trouble, or at least that's what he told himself to justify his prejudice. He flicked on his emergency lights, his pulse quickening with a sense of control. The red and blue lights flashed in Darnell's rearview mirror. He sighed deeply, gripping the wheel tighter. This wasn't new. Despite his tailored suit, his luxury car, and his spotless record, he was often reduced to nothing more than his skin color. He pulled over carefully, resting his hands on the wheel, a gesture learned from years of navigating these situations. Rickman approached slowly, his shoes clicking against the pavement, his badge gleaming in the dim light. His expression was cold, his voice sharp. "License and registration," Rickman ordered, not bothering with pleasantries. Darnell handed over the documents without hesitation, keeping his tone calm. "Good evening, Agent. Is there a problem?" Rickman barely glanced at the papers before fixing Darnell with a piercing stare. "You know why I stopped you?" "Honestly, no," Darnell replied, his voice steady but firm. Rickman's lips curled into a faint sneer. "Luxury car, late at night, on a bridge. Suspicious, don't you think?" Darnell suppressed the anger rising in his chest. He had worked too hard to let men like Rickman drag him into unnecessary conflict. "With respect, Agent, that's not a crime." Rickman's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer, the weight of his authority pressing down. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. The cold wind hit Darnell as he stepped onto the bridge, his breath visible in the icy air. Rickman began his interrogation, his questions laced with insinuations. "Where are you coming from?" Rickman asked, circling Darnell like a predator. "I was finalizing plans for a community center," Darnell explained, his tone unwavering. Rickman's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "A community center? Or a front for something else?" Darnell held his ground, his frustration mounting. "I've done nothing wrong. If you're looking for something illegal, you're wasting your time." Rickman wasn't listening. He searched Darnell's car and soon found a leather pouch in the glove compartment containing a thick wad of cash. To Rickman, this was more than enough to feed his bias. "Carrying this much cash, not exactly legal behavior, is it?" Rickman sneered, holding the money aloft. "It's my money," Darnell shot back, his voice firm. "I carry it for emergencies." Rickman's smirk widened. "Emergency like paying someone off." Darnell's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to give Rickman the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Unseen by either man, a 12-year-old black boy named Jamal crouched behind a dumpster near the bridge. Jamal had been wandering the area, seeking an escape from the chaos of the group home where he lived. But tonight, he stumbled upon something far worse. From his hiding spot, Jamal watched the confrontation unfold. Though he couldn't hear every word, the tension between the two men was palpable. He pulled a battered smartphone from his pocket, the cracked screen flickering to life. Jamal hit record, his hands trembling as he captured the scene. Rickman's interrogation escalated. "I've dealt with plenty like you," Rickman hissed, stepping closer to Darnell. "Think your money makes you untouchable. But not tonight." Darnell's voice rose, defiant. "You're abusing your power. You know this is harassment." Rickman's face darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "Power? You have no idea what power looks like." Before Darnell could respond, Rickman shoved him violently toward the edge of the bridge. Time slowed as Darnell stumbled backward. His polished shoes scraped against the concrete before his body toppled over the railing. The splash of his body hitting the freezing water below was deafening in the quiet night. Rickman froze, his breath ragged as he scanned the area. Satisfied no one had seen, he adjusted his tie, returned to his car, and drove off, his taillights vanishing into the distance. Jamal didn't move. His small hands gripped the phone, its recording still running. He had just witnessed something no child should ever see, a powerful man committing an unforgivable act. But Jamal also knew something else. He had captured the truth, and the truth had power. The city of Charleston, with its cobblestone streets and antebellum architecture, held stories of resilience and oppression in equal measure. It was a place where progress and prejudice lived side by side, and this duality bled into the lives of its people. As the night wore on, the chilling events on the Ravenel Bridge began to ripple outward, setting off a chain of consequences. Darnell Williams, even in death, left an indelible mark. Those who knew him described a man who carried himself with quiet dignity. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline and skin the color of polished mahogany. His presence commanded attention in boardrooms and community centers alike. But it was his empathy that truly set him apart. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, Darnell's early life was a testament to survival. The poverty of Charleston's East Side molded him, but it never defined him. He grew up watching his mother sacrifice everything to ensure he and his siblings had a chance. That chance came when Darnell earned a scholarship to an Ivy League university, where he not only thrived academically, but also confronted the stark reality of being one of the few black faces in a sea of privilege. After college, Darnell returned to Charleston with a singular goal: to rebuild the community that had raised him. He didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to uplift others. Yet, despite his achievements, he was painfully aware of the fine line he walked as a black man in America. His wealth could buy many things, but it couldn't erase the assumptions people made about him. Special Agent Kyle Rickman, on the other hand, was the embodiment of a system that rewarded unchecked power. Rickman had spent decades climbing the ranks of the FBI, his rise fueled by a mix of competence and opportunism. But beneath the polished veneer of his career was a man deeply resentful of the changing world. Born into a working-class family, Rickman had grown up in a small, predominantly white town where conformity was king. He thrived in environments that valued obedience over questioning, a trait that served him well in the bureau. Yet, as the years passed and the FBI began to diversify, Rickman felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He despised the new faces that filled the agency's ranks, faces that didn't look like his own. For Rickman, Darnell represented everything he loathed: success, defiance, and a challenge to the power structures he held sacred. Pulling Darnell over that night wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about reasserting control, and in a moment of blind hatred he crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Jamal, the 12-year-old boy who had witnessed everything, sat trembling in his makeshift hideout near the bridge. He was small for his age, his wiry frame a product of malnutrition and years spent in the foster care system. Life had taught Jamal to trust no one, to keep his head down and his mouth shut. But tonight was different. The video he had captured on his phone replayed in his mind like a nightmare. The image of Darnell being shoved over the bridge burned into his memory. Jamal knew what he had seen, and he knew its weight. It wasn't just another act of violence, it was a crime by someone who was supposed to protect people. Jamal's mind raced as he considered his next steps. He had no one to turn to, no family to confide in. The phone in his pocket felt heavier with each passing second, a burden he wasn't sure he could carry, but he also knew what it meant. That video was his proof, his chance to expose the truth. Meanwhile, Back at the riverbank, the icy waters of the Cooper River swallowed Darnell's body. The current carried him downstream, out of sight and seemingly out of reach. Rickman had been meticulous in covering his tracks, ensuring no physical evidence linked him to the crime. He drove away, confident that no one had seen him, that his position as a federal agent shielded him from suspicion. But guilt is a persistent shadow. As Rickman sat in his dimly lit apartment later that night, the silence pressed in on him. He replayed the moment in his head, convincing himself it was justified. Darnell had been a threat, a challenge to his authority. Yet, a gnawing unease crept into his thoughts. For all his confidence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The city began to stir as news spread of Darnell's disappearance. By morning, his absence was noticed, first by his assistant and then by his family. Calls went unanswered, and meetings were missed. Darnell was known for his punctuality and discipline, traits that made his silence all the more alarming. Within hours, a missing persons report was filed, and the news began to spread. Local reporters picked up the story, highlighting Darnell's contributions to the community. The headlines painted a stark contrast. Prominent black philanthropist vanishes under suspicious circumstances. Rickman, watching the news from his office, felt a flicker of unease. He had underestimated the impact of Darnell's disappearance. This wasn't just another statistic. This was a man with influence, a man whose absence would be noticed. Jamal sat in a dimly lit corner of the shelter, clutching the phone. The headlines on the communal TV confirmed what he already knew. The man he had seen fall from the bridge wasn't just anyone. He was someone important, someone whose life mattered to many people. For the first time, Jamal felt the weight of his decision. He had the power to expose the truth, but doing so would put a target on his back. Rickman was an FBI agent, a man with resources and connections. If Jamal went public, there was no telling what might happen to him. The disappearance of Darnell Williams rippled through Charleston like a stone dropped into still water. The city's black community was quick to rally, organizing vigils and demanding answers. Local news outlets plastered Darnell's face across their broadcasts, describing his accomplishments and the lives he had touched. Yet, as the hours stretched into days with no sign of him, frustration mounted. Jamal sat in the shadows of the shelter's shared lounge, his thumb hovering over the play button of the video he'd recorded. He watched it again and again, each viewing a fresh stab of fear and guilt. The grainy footage showed everything: Darnell's stoic defiance, the cruel sneer on Agent Kyle Rickman's face, and the fatal shove that sent Darnell plunging into the icy waters of the Cooper River. Jamal's heart raced as he considered his options. Could he trust the police? Absolutely not. He knew what happened to kids like him when they went against men in power, but he couldn't stay silent either. Darnell deserved justice. Across town, Rickman was unraveling. The mounting attention on Darnell's disappearance was more than he'd anticipated. In his mind, it was supposed to be simple: a late-night stop, a show of dominance, a quick erasure of a man he viewed as a threat to his order. But the world wasn't letting this one slide. As Rickman sat in his office at the Charleston FBI field office, his colleagues bustled around him, unaware of the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Every news broadcast about Darnell felt like a blade digging into his chest. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was his supervisor, asking for updates on the missing persons case. "We're monitoring it," Rickman lied smoothly. "Coordinating with local authorities. Could be a random disappearance. No signs of foul play so far." But Rickman knew better. He had no way of predicting how long he could keep the truth buried, especially in a world where even the smallest slip could go viral. Meanwhile, Jamal made a bold decision. He sneaked out of the shelter late one night, his phone tucked safely in his pocket. He headed to Sonia Vega, a local journalist known for exposing corruption in Charleston's institutions. Sonia, a Latina reporter in her early 30s, had built her career on fearlessness. She'd taken on corrupt politicians, abusive law enforcement, and shady corporations, and she wasn't about to back down now. Jamal found her at the North Charleston Gazette office, pacing in her cluttered workspace. He hesitated in the doorway, his nerves almost getting the better of him. "What can I do for you, kid?" Sonia asked, her sharp eyes assessing him. I saw something," Jamal stammered. "Something bad, about that man who disappeared, Darnell Williams." Sonia's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean you saw something?" Jamal pulled out his phone. the cracked screen glowing as he queued up the video. "I recorded it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As the video played, Sonia's expression shifted from skepticism to horror. She sat down, her breath catching as she watched the grainy footage of Rickman pushing Darnell off the bridge. "This is," she began, her voice trembling. "This is evidence of murder." Jamal nodded, his face pale. "But he's FBI. He's gonna come after me if he finds out." Sonia leaned forward, her voice firm. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't. You did the right thing coming here. This video, it changes everything." The next morning, Sonia published a bombshell article on the Gazette's website. FBI agent accused in disappearance of Black millionaire. Shocking video surfaces. She embedded the video directly into the article, ensuring it would be seen by as many people as possible. Within hours, the story went viral. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Justice for Darnell," and mainstream outlets began picking up the story. Rickman's name and face were plastered across every major network. The FBI scrambled to respond, launching an internal investigation and placing Rickman on administrative leave. But the public outrage was unrelenting. Protests erupted in downtown Charleston, with demonstrators marching to demand justice for Darnell. Rickman's world began to collapse. Trapped in his home, he watched the news coverage with growing panic. He knew his career was over, but what terrified him more was the possibility of prison, or worse. He had spent years building himself up as a paragon of law and order, and now he was the villain in the country's most explosive scandal. But Rickman wasn't done yet. Desperation fueled his next move. He began digging for information on Sonia and Jamal, determined to silence them before they could do more damage. Jamal, now under Sonia's protection, stayed hidden in a safe house provided by the Gazette. Despite his fear, he felt a sense of relief knowing the truth was out. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had the power to make a difference. But Rickman's reach was long, and his connections within law enforcement were loyal. Late one night, a black SUV pulled up outside the safe house. Sonia, ever vigilant, noticed the vehicle and immediately called her editor. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tense. "Rickman's people." Jamal froze as Sonia ushered him into a back room. "Stay quiet," she instructed. "No matter what happens, don't come out." The sound of heavy boots echoed outside as figures approached the house. The quiet of the night shattered as a heavy knock echoed through the safe house. Sonia's pulse quickened as she glanced at the front door. Through the peephole, she saw two men in dark suits, their postures stiff, their expressions cold. It didn't take a seasoned journalist to know who they were. Sonia turned to Jamal, who was trembling in the dimly lit back room. "Stay here. Don't make a sound," she whispered. She closed the door behind her, her heart pounding as she made her way to the front. She opened the door just enough to meet their eyes. "Can I help you?" One of the men flashed a badge. "Special Agent Ward. We're with the FBI. We need to ask you a few questions." Sonia forced a neutral expression. "Questions about what?" "About a video you've published," the agent replied. His tone was calm, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. In the back room, Jamal crouched behind a pile of boxes, clutching his phone as if it were a lifeline. He strained to hear the conversation, his breath shallow. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. At the door, Sonia crossed her arms, blocking their view inside. "If you have questions, you can contact my editor. I'm not at liberty to discuss confidential sources." Agent Ward leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "Ms. Vega, we're here to protect your source, not to intimidate them. But you've put yourself in a dangerous position by publishing that video. The man involved is highly trained and has a lot of allies." "I appreciate the concern," Sonia said dryly, her sharp eyes locking with his. "But if this is about intimidation, I suggest you file your complaints with the First Amendment." Ward's expression hardened. "We'll be in touch." He stepped back, motioning to his partner, and they retreated to their SUV. Sonia watched as the vehicle idled for a moment before pulling away. She locked the door and took a deep breath. The weight of the moment sank in as she returned to Jamal. "They're gone for now," she said, her voice steady but tense. "But we need to move you. They'll be back." Meanwhile, Kyle Rickman sat in a dimly lit motel room, his nerves fraying as he pieced together his next move. The walls were closing in, and every news broadcast felt like a countdown to his downfall. He knew Sonia Vega was a problem, but it was the boy who terrified him. He's a loose end, Rickman muttered to himself. His paranoia drove him to action. He picked up his phone and dialed a contact within law enforcement, someone who owed him favors. "I need intel," he barked into the phone. "Find the boy. Vega's hiding him, and when you do, handle it." The silence on the other end lingered before the voice responded, hesitant but compliant. "Understood." Rickman hung up, his chest heaving. He had spent years burying skeletons, but this time one had clawed its way to the surface. Jamal and Sonia relocated to a new safe house, a nondescript townhouse on the outskirts of the city. The Gazette provided round-the-clock security, but Sonia knew it wouldn't be enough to stop someone like Rickman. Days passed, and the media frenzy only grew. Protests swelled in size, with chants of justice for Darnell echoing through Charleston's streets. Activists and public figures joined the cause, amplifying the story on a national scale. But Rickman wasn't going to wait for the truth to fully surface. One stormy night, the safe house's front door was breached with a thunderous crash. Sonia and Jamal were jolted awake by the sound of boots stomping through the hallway. "Jamal, hide!" Sonia shouted, grabbing her phone and dialing 911. Jamal darted into a small closet, squeezing himself into the cramped space as his heart raced. He could hear muffled voices and the heavy thud of furniture being overturned. "Where's the boy?" one of the intruders barked. Sonia's voice was defiant. "I don't know what you're talking about." A sharp crack echoed, a slap that sent Sonia crashing to the floor. Jamal covered his mouth, stifling a gasp. From his hiding place, he clutched his phone, scrolling to the video. His finger hovered over the upload button. It was his last resort, a way to ensure the truth got out, even if it meant risking everything. As the intruders moved closer, Jamal made a choice. He hit the button. The screen flashed. Uploading. In a matter of minutes, the video was live on every major platform. Notifications flooded in, as people across the country shared and commented on the damning footage. The momentum was unstoppable. The intruders' radios crackled with frantic voices. "Pull out now, it's over." Realizing the video had gone public, the men retreated, leaving Sonia bruised but alive. Jamal emerged from the closet, tears streaming down his face. "You were brave," Sonia said, her voice trembling as she embraced him. Across town, Rickman watched the video resurface, his face pale. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls he refused to answer. He knew what was coming. The FBI's Internal Affairs Division would descend on him, stripping away the power he had wielded for so long. But even as the walls closed in, Rickman wasn't ready to give up. He reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a handgun. If this was the end, he would face it on his terms. The disappearance of Darnell Williams, a self-made black millionaire and philanthropist, had already sent shockwaves through Charleston. But when the video of FBI Special Agent Kyle Rickman shoving him off the Ravenel Bridge went viral, it was like a dam breaking. Outrage erupted across the nation, flooding the streets with protests, filling airwaves with debates, and sparking an unrelenting demand for justice. On social media, the hashtag #SocialJustice climbed to the top of trending lists within hours. Posts shared personal stories of how Darnell had impacted lives through his housing projects, scholarships, and mentorship programs. Others highlighted the systemic injustices that allowed men like Rickman to wield power unchecked. The narrative became larger than Darnell himself. It was a flashpoint for a country grappling with deeply rooted issues of racism and abuse of power. Jamal, the 12-year-old boy who had secretly recorded the murder, now found himself in the eye of this storm. Sitting in a corner of the Gazette's bustling newsroom, he clutched a mug of hot chocolate, his small hands trembling. Journalists swarmed around, piecing together coverage of the story, but Jamal remained silent, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what he had done. "Jamal," said Sonia Vega, the journalist who had helped break the story, as she crouched beside him. Her voice was soft, but her words carried urgency. "You've done something incredible. Because of you, the world knows what happened to Mr. Williams. But you need to understand, it's not over yet. Rickman is dangerous, and there are people out there who will want to silence you." Jamal nodded slowly, his eyes wide with fear. I just want people to know the truth," he murmured. "And they do," Sonia assured him. "But you're not alone in this. I promise I'll protect you." Across town, Rickman was unraveling. He sat in the dim confines of a secure holding cell, his once impeccable suit now wrinkled, his face drawn with exhaustion. His mind churned with schemes and paranoia. For years, Rickman had wielded his badge like a weapon, manipulating the system and protecting his interests. Now, the very institution he had used to shield himself was turning against him. The video, undeniable in its clarity, had left him with few allies. The FBI had no choice but to suspend him and launch a full investigation into his actions. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors were building a case against him, combing through his history and uncovering patterns of misconduct, complaints of racial profiling, abuse of authority, and tampering with evidence surfaced. Allegations that had been buried for years under layers of bureaucracy and influence. Rickman's phone calls to old contacts went unanswered. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his life he was powerless to stop it. Charleston, once known for its serene charm, had become a city on edge. The streets were filled with protests day and night, with demonstrators carrying signs that read, "Darnell deserved better, justice for the people, and end police terror." At the same time, counter-protests began to spring up, fueled by Rickman's supporters and those who saw the video as an attack on law enforcement. Tensions boiled over when a scuffle broke out during a march across the Ravenel Bridge, resulting in several arrests. The bridge, now a symbol of both tragedy and resilience, became the focal point of the city's unrest. Back at the Gazette, Sonia and her editor, Marcus Fisher, worked tirelessly to ensure Jamal's safety. The boy had been moved to a second safe house after credible threats surfaced online, including doxing attempts by Rickman's supporters. Sonia stayed by his side, her protective instincts kicking into overdrive. "Marcus, we need more security," she said during a late-night call. "Rickman's people are relentless, and Jamal's just a kid. If anything happens to him—" "It won't," Marcus interrupted. "We're not going to let that happen. I've got a team on this." Still, Sonia couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at her. She knew how the system worked, how powerful men like Rickman had ways of slipping through the cracks. As the legal proceedings began, the courthouse became a spectacle. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while reporters jostled for position. Protesters gathered outside, their chants echoing off the stone facade. The trial wasn't just about Rickman. It was a referendum on the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Inside, Jamal sat in a quiet waiting area, dressed in a borrowed suit. His hands fidgeted in his lap as he glanced at Sonia, who gave him a reassuring smile. "You'll do fine," she said softly. "Just tell the truth." When Jamal was called to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He climbed onto the chair, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing surroundings. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor instructed. "Jamal Carter," he replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. As the questioning began, Jamal recounted the events of that night. He described how he'd been wandering near the bridge, how he'd seen Rickman push Darnell over the edge, and how he'd recorded it all. The prosecutor played the video for the jury, the haunting footage filling the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the audience, and even some jurors looked visibly shaken. Rickman, sitting at the defense table, watched Jamal with an icy stare, but the boy didn't look away. Outside the courthouse, the city remained a battleground. Activists continued their marches, their voices unwavering. Meanwhile, Rickman's supporters grew increasingly aggressive, spreading conspiracy theories that painted the video as fake and accusing Jamal of being a pawn in a larger scheme. The tension culminated one evening when a group of counter-protesters surrounded a peaceful vigil for Darnell. The scene quickly turned violent, with police stepping in to break up the clashes. For many, the chaos underscored the very issues at the heart of the trial. As the trial wore on, the prosecution unveiled a damning array of evidence against Rickman. Former colleagues testified about his history of misconduct, detailing how he had manipulated cases and targeted vulnerable communities. Internal FBI documents revealed a pattern of complaints that had been quietly dismissed, further fueling the public's outrage. Rickman's defense team, however, tried to spin a different narrative. They portrayed Darnell as a potential threat, suggesting that Rickman had acted in self-defense. The strategy backfired when the prosecution highlighted Darnell's spotless record and well-documented philanthropy. The trial became a national spectacle, with coverage dominating headlines. Late-night talk shows, podcasts, and social media dissected every detail, sparking heated debates about systemic racism, police accountability, and the role of power in American society. Through it all, Jamal remained a central figure. Despite the threats and the weight of public scrutiny, he stood firm, his courage inspiring others to speak out. Community leaders began calling him a hero, while organizations across the country reached out to offer support. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed as the foreperson rose to deliver the decision. On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant, Kyle Rickman, guilty. The room erupted into a mix of cheers and tears. Outside, a massive crowd gathered to hear the news, their collective roar echoing through the streets as the verdict was announced. The trial's conclusion didn't end the story. It marked the beginning of a larger movement. Inspired by Darnell's legacy and Jamal's bravery, activists launched new initiatives aimed at reforming law enforcement and holding public officials accountable. The Darnell Williams Foundation was established, funded by donors from across the country, to continue his work in underserved communities. Meanwhile, Rickman's sentencing hearing loomed. Though his conviction was a victory, many believed true justice required a harsh punishment. When the judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, it sent a clear message. No one, not even those in the highest positions of power, was above the law. Months later, a new community center bearing Darnell Williams's name opened in Charleston. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew thousands, including Sonia and Jamal. For the first time, Jamal felt a sense of hope. As he stood before the crowd, microphone in hand, his voice was steady. Mr. Williams believed in building a better future for everyone, he said. He stood up for people who didn't have a voice, and because of him, I found mine. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers ringing out across the city. In the distance, the Ravenel Bridge stood tall, a silent reminder of the tragedy that had sparked a movement, and of the boy who had dared to stand up to power. The story of Darnell Williams and Jamal Carter is not just about a tragic event. It's a mirror reflecting the injustices woven into the fabric of society. It's a testament to the courage of those who dare to stand against oppression, even when the odds seem insurmountable. This story has resonated with millions, but its true power lies in what comes next, how we choose to respond. Darnell's life symbolized resilience, hope, and the drive to create opportunities for others. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a bridge builder, lifting up his community and inspiring a new generation to dream bigger. Yet, his tragic end underscores a harsh reality. No amount of success can shield someone from the prejudice entrenched in systemic power structures. Jamal's bravery, on the other hand, is a reminder that even the smallest voice can carry the weight of the truth. His decision to act, to expose a man like Kyle Rickman, reminds us that change often begins with a single person willing to take a stand. Jamal didn't have power, influence, or resources, but he had courage, and that made all the difference. Now their story challenges us to act. It's not enough to be shocked or outraged. If we want a society where stories like Darnell's are no longer possible, we must work for it. Support reform, advocate for policy changes that ensure transparency and accountability in law enforcement, demand better training, independent oversight, and the removal of those who abuse their power. Invest in communities. Darnell's legacy was built on investing in underserved communities. Support organizations and initiatives that provide education, housing, and opportunities to those who need them most. Amplify voices. Like Sonia Vega did for Jamal, use your platform to elevate the voices of those fighting injustice. Share their stories, advocate for their causes, and ensure they're heard. Get involved. Locally, grassroots activism is one of the most effective ways to create change. Join local organizations, attend town halls, and push for accountability at every level of government. Educate and reflect. Change starts with understanding. Educate yourself and others about systemic racism, power imbalances, and how historical inequalities continue to impact the present. The story of Darnell and Jamal isn't over. It lives on in every action taken to challenge the injustices they faced. It's a story of hope, of resilience, and of the power of truth. What will you do to honor their legacy? Will you stand for justice? Will you speak for those whose voices are silenced? Change is possible, but it starts with you. Take the first step. Let their story fuel your resolve, and together, let's build a world where no one is judged by the color of their skin, but by the strength of their character.